Hi, I want to welcome you to Answers for Today. What a joy it is to be here. Of course, you see two things that are different. Number one, we're at Agape Chapel on a Sunday night in front of a live audience doing the program. And secondly, Chris is not in Texas. We're not green screening you in or anything like that. You're actually here, Chris. So
yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Actually, better than usual because the weather back home is horrid.
Yeah.
And so they're losing power and all kinds of crazy stuff back there. So,
yeah. But when we've been doing these programs, we're in the middle of a series that we started about 6 weeks ago. And the series was, if somebody would come up and ask you about Jesus, if they would just ask you about Jesus, what would your response be? And we kind of broke it down concerning if somebody would ask you about his deity, is Jesus God? How would you respond to that? And we did a program or so on that. And secondly, we did if somebody would ask you about the humanity of Jesus, did Jesus actually live and walk and breathe amongst us? And so we did a program. The third one was, if somebody came up and asked you, why did Jesus suffer? Why did he have to suffer? Why did he die on a cross? And we did a couple programs on that, and then we went to the resurrection. And so that brings us now, if somebody came up and asked you about Jesus, and they would simply ask you, is Jesus actually going to come back again? And so that's the question that we have here tonight that we're to be looking at. And of course, we believe that the Bible supports the fact that Jesus Christ is going to come back again. Well, I think it was John MacArthur one time said, right? Well, after he was defeated over there in the Pacific, he says, I'm going to come back. His words were true, Chris. But so do you see and do you believe that the scriptures support the fact that Jesus' claim that he's going to come back?
Sure. I'll take him in his own words. When he asked it in kind of a way of talking about how bad things may very well be as far as the faith of the people. But he says, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? So it's a foregone conclusion he's coming back. And the great news is that for you and I, when we're asked that question, or any of you, if that question's ever asked of any of you, you don't have to give your opinion. You can say, well, the Bible's clear on the whole matter. We just sang the song from Job 19:25, My Redeemer lives. So more than likely, Job was writing all that before there was even a law. Yes. So redeemed from what and why? But he knew all of that. So obviously God gave him insight that we don't even understand. But there was no question that he would see a physical resurrection of his body. And so Paul reasons through all of that and explains that if all of that still needs to take place and all of the transformation that will happen with us, that is all tied into when he returns to the earth. So whether you use his words or whatever.
You go to the oldest book unknown to mankind, sure. The book of Job, and it already speaks about there will be a day of redemption in which the Lord's going to come back. But Chris, before we even get into the second coming of Jesus, why don't you give everybody really an understanding that there's a distinct difference between the rapture of the church and the second coming. Why don't you explain that in 100 words or less?
Well, okay, let's see. So you're going to keep the time on that one too, Chuck? All right. The most important thing for us to understand, I think it really breaks down nicely just with what Paul had written to the Thessalonians in chapter 4 and chapter 5, because between chapter 4 and 5, there's an obvious break in subject matter. Because chapter 4 deals with that we're gathered to him, caught up to be with him. And it works really well with John 14, 1 through 6, where he talks about being the way, the truth, and the life. But he begins by saying, I go to prepare a place for you. Mm-hmm. So all of those who would die would come to him, and then he would retrieve the rest at the rapture. And we go to where he is. But when he comes back at the second coming, Revelation 19, he comes to the earth. And so for us, chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians says, comfort one another with these words. That's great news. But if you're one of the people that's here on earth that's coming back to be judged at Revelation 19, that's not great news. Yeah. So there's not a lot of comfort in that because it's a time of judgment. So he returns to the earth.
I'm glad you said that, Chris, because it's important that we understand when we talk about the rapture of the church, there's a great understanding for the pre, mid, and those poor people that think it's going to happen at the end.
The U-turn.
Why is it so vital for us to teach and believe in the pre-rapture, before the tribulation rapture?
Sure. And this is, has there been a more hotly contested thing maybe in the last 5 to 10 years than that question of the timing? It's really interesting because that's really something that has been really on the forefront. And so the big debate goes that why would the church think that somehow it's going to escape when people have had to be martyred through the years and all the rest of it, and why is it if there's trouble everywhere else in the world, why should we think that somehow we would escape? And there are a lot of good arguments. Why would God allow a portion of his bride to go through that battering of 3.5 years? Makes no sense to me. But let alone the fact that they try to break it up as saying that the second half of the tribulation, or the great tribulation, is the wrath of God, but the first half of it is the wrath of man. That's how they usually describe it. And I have to just answer the question by saying, but who's opening the seals? Jesus. So if the eternal word of God is the one opening the seals, then where's that wrath? And who's it that's introducing those things? And if we believe it to be literal, that's 2 billion people in the first 4 seals gone from the planet. Sounds a lot like wrath to me.
Yes.
And so the idea that we would be here for it, to what end? Is God not able to get the word out at that time? So the reason that I have always subscribed to a pre-tribulation rapture is there's no reason for the church to be here, and again, there's nothing that shows me in the text, especially when you look at the book of Revelation, that the church is here. Again, it's a time that he's judging those who dwell upon the earth, and it's a time of bringing Israel back to him through just terrible, terrible trouble. But again, the church is not really a participant in those things.
So if you want to know that more in detail, we've done previous programs on the rapture of the church, and I'm sure we're going to do more programs down the road on it. But going back to what we were talking about, the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I first of all like to take a look at the Old Testament. I believe that the Old Testament speaks of it. And in particular, I'll be reading to you out of Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, where it speaks about the two comings of Jesus. And sometimes we lose that, is that there's a first coming of the Messiah that we talk about, and we celebrate, especially on during Passion Week, about his suffering and the reasoning behind it, where it tells us in very familiar verses, where in verse 1 of chapter 61 of Isaiah, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek, and he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim the liberty to the captives, and to opening the prisons to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and then what, Chris? And the day of vengeance of our God, and comfort those who are mourned.
Right.
So we already see there in Isaiah, it speaks about, I see it, and I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about there's 2 comings of the Messiah.
And if you remember, this is what Jesus read in the synagogue at Nazareth when they were so angry with him, and he stopped midway through that verse because he talked about the acceptable year of the Lord. He stopped and he handed back to the attendant and said, "Today this has come true in your hearing." So he stopped at why he was here for the first time, because there was going to need to be an offering made for sin, that man could be reconciled. When he returns, he's not here to do that again, but it's to those who would not bow the knee to him. They're going to have to face him as judge. So that's the vengeance of Almighty
That's
God.
the vengeance that you see there in Isaiah,
Sure.
where Revelation chapter 6 through 18 describes it for us. When he comes back, is the judgment that you're talking about.
Certainly.
At that point. Okay.
It happens. It's very plain to see. It starts at around verse 11 of chapter 19 of Revelation, and it's clear. He comes back to earth. He's the conquering King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the ones who would oppose him are going to meet with, if I could be so crass, the business end of his wrath. Because these are the people who they live in a way of rebellion. They've rejected him by following Antichrist, and this is what will happen as he returns. There's a judgment that is coming.
You know, when we go over to Israel, and Chris goes over there quite a bit, and I've been over there several times, we find ourselves, we make our way up to the Mount of Olives. You know, as you're there in Acts chapter 1, I don't know if you've taught it there. I always enjoy listening to Acts chapter 1 where the angel speaks to the entire, everybody that's gathered and said, why gaze ye up into heaven? Because they say, the angels say, this same Jesus is going to come back in like manner.
Sure.
And I think it's very interesting about how we think about the Lord coming in the clouds, how the Bible speaks of it, of him coming in his majesty in the cloud. And I'm going to read to Chris Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, and then have him talk a little bit about the Son of Man or Jesus coming back. He said, I saw in the night vision, this is Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancients of Days, and they brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion, glory, and kingdom to all people, nations, and language should serve him, and his dominion should be an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom which shall not be destroyed. What a mouthful right there, right? Why don't you talk a little bit about the prophecy of Daniel there in chapter 7, how he speaks about, first of all, he calls him the Son of Man, and how we're identifying Jesus as being the Son of Man, and the authority by which he says that even like the angel said, he's coming back. Sure. He's in this great cloud of witness. Sure.
Yeah, and this is why it's wonderful that you know that there is a complete continuity between old and new. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why it's the beauty of what I think we do as a tradition of church is that we say the Old Testament is every bit as instructive and important to us as the New. They're completely compatible. Some would say that you can teach the full counsel of God without even going into the Old Testament, which is really nonsense.
Yeah, those guys need to step out of the pulpit. Chris.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, they use that term of the full counsel of God taken from Acts chapter 20. But how much of the Bible was still to be written when he said that? Mm-hmm. There was still a whole lot to be written of the Bible. So that whole idea is just absurd. But think about this, what Daniel says. Remember what ends up at the end of Daniel where God says, now shut up this book and the things that are said here until those times of the end. Now what does he instruct John to say? Now write these things. The time is now. Write these things that have been, that are, and will come. So that wonderful, I've said these things through Daniel, but for a time, and then their time will come when it's going to then be revealed. So the continuity that you have is the revelation of Jesus Christ. The apocalypsis in the Greek is really the revealing of when he will do the things that he will do that Daniel saw, and all eyes will see him, which is different than the rapture. It's not every eye sees him at the rapture. It's the church being collected to him, caught up with him. But when he comes back to the earth, everybody knows it. There's no doubt.
Chris, one of the things that I find interesting in verse 14 of chapter 7, where it talks about it was given to him dominion, and it's going to be an everlasting dominion over every nation, language should serve him. Throughout history, man has sought to have that dominion all the way back from the Egyptians to Alexander the Great. You could go on and on and on. Even today, there's people within governments that would like to have dominion over the entire world. Right. But we see this, speaking of an everlasting dominion, which I think also speaks into the millennial reign of Christ that we see here. And I just like to think that his kingdom shall not be destroyed.
Sure.
Because it speaks about the Babylonian kingdom that was destroyed, the Medes and the Persian, and everybody up to this point that Daniel knew and saw, and now he's talking about a kingdom that won't be destroyed.
Sure, because who's going to destroy it? There's nobody with the pedigree to be able to do something like that. The thing that I find is really wonderful when we got to do the topic of his resurrection, that's so wide-ranging what Paul deals with in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, that it is the essential belief that we must have in the resurrection of Jesus. But he doesn't end there, because look at what you see at verse 23 of that same chapter of 15, because it deals with this. It says, speaking of resurrection, it speaks of Jesus, and it says, each after his own, but Christ the first fruits, the first of his kind, resurrected from the dead but never died again. So think of Lazarus or anyone else that was resurrected from the dead. They died a second time. Jesus being the first fruits, the first of a kind. Then it says, And then those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom of to God the Father, and he puts an end to all rule and authority and power. Paul has that in his resurrection chapter, because Jesus did resurrect, and because he's gone back to the Father. The day will come when he will come back to the earth and subdue it and deliver it back to the Father, putting it back where it was supposed to be. One other thing on that, I believe that is exactly the beginning of the sequence of what Peter was talking about in Acts chapter 3, when he talked about the restoration of all things. Mm. And when everything gets put back to its former glory before the fall, that's what he ends up doing in that whole process. Peter says that so matter of fact, if you know what I'm talking about there, when he was talking about that to the people that it was after the healing and that you must receive Jesus, that heaven received up until the time of the restoration of all things, still future to our times. But we do know the glimpses of it because Paul gives us a little preview of it. The whole book of Revelation deals with it.
And so when we're talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ, the world's going to change. There's going to be a restoration of all things. Yep. But before I get to that thought, I do want to talk a little bit back to the Mount of Olives. And out of the book of Zechariah, I find it's very interesting. And maybe I'll just share a little bit of it and then have you talk about it. And it says in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 4 through 9. I'm not going to read all of it, but it says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives." And again, the fulfillment, what the angel says, that he will return at that time. And he says, and I'm dropping down to verse number 9, "And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one." Yeah. What a tremendous prophecy there in Zechariah chapter 14.
Sure, it's the return. Now, how many of you have been to Israel? Okay, so you know what the Mount of Olives looks like. You know how close it is. So when he steps foot on that, you'll see it from the Temple Mount. It's right there. Yes. It's hundreds of yards is all that it is, depending on if you're really low on the mountain when you're in the Garden of Gethsemane, or even up at the top of it where he came in at triumphal entry. You're still seeing it. I mean, you've all seen the pictures of that whole eastern part of the wall and the dome and all that stuff. That's the Mount of Olives, and that's looking right at it. So imagine this, standing on the Temple Mount and seeing someone come, and as soon as their foot hits the ground, it splits open.
That's what the rest of Zechariah talks about, where the water's going to go down and heal. Yeah. The Dead Sea, right? It's going to go down. I mean, and it's that salt and water is going to be made fresh, the best we could understand, and that's the beginning of the healing of this world. Where when the Lord comes back, it's just going to. When we say the restoration of all things,
so think about it this way: that the water would run into the Kidron Valley and join in with the Hinnom, or the Valley of Gehenna, and then it runs out to the east, which puts it in the low-lying area of what is the Dead Sea. And then it repopulates that again, and it makes it so it brings life. And we've been there. If you've seen the Dead Sea, man, it's made that, it has that distinction for a reason. It's all kinds of dead. But again, it's so rich in mineral and everything. Add a lot of clean water to it, and it's going to be like, the Garden of God is what it says.
So, Chris, before we get to the New Testament, and I'd like to hold off on that a little bit, and as we shift gears, we're talking about the return of Jesus Christ, and what I'd like to do is ask you, as we look at the world today, do you see evidence, without, obviously you do, that's really pointing to the fact that we're getting close to the end? Is there, give us a couple telltale signs that we should be looking for, that we are close to the end before the Lord's coming back?
Okay, without being political, right?
Well, it's okay. We're on, we're amongst friends.
Well, here I was back at Cyprus this morning, at the church that I pastored, and I asked this simple question. It's almost a year since my wife and I had moved away from there, and I was able to ask all the people there at the church if, when we left at the beginning of March of last year, and I had said to you, let's fast forward a year and here's where we're going to be. We're going to be in the middle of all of the weirdness with COVID, and then, especially for that particular fellowship, all of the tragedy that they've had there, but just COVID and just the way that that's gone and how it's changed the entire world and how it operates. Who could have imagined it? In fact, we would say, We didn't see that coming. And yet you can say, but God did. He's never surprised. I mean, we all understand that he never wakes up and says, well, wow, didn't see that one coming. So, of course, he knows, but then look at the way that the world is seeing this as an opportunity. The people that really make all the decisions that we see for nations and for everything are looking at this as a great opportunity to reconfigure things in the way that they want it. So seeing something along those lines and what they're proposing, the conditioning that's happening, think about what we read in the book of Revelation when the man of sin is revealed. Or there are some who would say that the Antichrist is actually a literal single person, or it could be an entity, a governing group of people or whatever. And that debate can go ahead and rage. The thing is that the world is transformed and it is subjected under a very, very small group of people making all of the decisions. It's hard to imagine a better opportunity, and they are honest. If you read about this stuff, the people talking about, here's our window of opportunity and we see it, let's refigure the world in our image the way that we want. We've never seen this to this extent before. But at the same time, the believer should be saying, well, it's right on schedule. The world is wondering, how can this type of a thing be? And the people that like to make the decisions are saying, we cannot miss this opportunity.
And I'm glad that's kind of where I wanted to go with is we have 5 minutes or so left, Chris, and where Jesus said, when you take these things in consideration out of Matthew, he says, therefore be ye also ready. In such an hour as you think not that the Son of Man cometh. What would you say to people who are watching online right now and later on his channel? What are the key things for us to do to be ready for the second coming, in our case, the rapture of the church? What should we be doing?
Same thing we've been doing for, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. How long have you been walking with the Lord? Every morning you wake up and say, I may see him today.
Yes.
But I may not. Well, what's going to happen between now and then? I don't know. It's not for me to know. If it was for me to know, he'd have told me. What I do know is that I'll see him someday. And, there are a lot of people in this room I know who've been around the movement, especially around Calvary Chapel, for a very, very long time. And there are so many times we were sure we're going home, and only come to find out that our timing was off.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I finally realized something, that the rapture of the church, or when we see him, let's just make it easy. When we see him face to face is not a date, it's an event. So if we treat it as an event that we don't know when it's going to happen, we get out of that habit of saying, well, this has got to be it. Because let's face it, when we were talking about this stuff in the 80s and the 90s, you asked yourself, well, how much worse could it get? Now you're saying, I wish I'd never asked the question. Because here it's become so almost unrecognizable what the world has become. And yet, could it get worse? Certainly. But our hope hasn't changed. So we are to be, every single day that we wake, we say, if this is my last day on the planet, praise the Lord, I'll live to his glory.
Yes.
If we're here for whatever indefinite amount of time, it doesn't change the fact that I see him sooner or later. We're only here for a time.
Yes.
And we should get our minds around that, live every day as though it is the last, and yet say, but if I'm here tomorrow, I still have things that I'm to do for his sake, for his kingdom.
Chris, back in the day, many, many years ago now, probably in the early, he was Monday nights over at Calvary Chapel, Pastor Chuck, in the late 70s or right around there, started a Monday night study. And he was doing similar to what we're doing now, doing prophecy updates and sharing with everybody that was there. And he would come out, believe it or not, sit on a stool. We're sitting on stools, but he would have a newspaper with him. And he would just be reading the newspaper and saying the headlines are pointing to the fact that Jesus Christ is coming back soon. And you fast forward now 40 years or so, like you said, it's like it's ramping up so quickly. It's not a day that you don't go by and say, man, did you see this? Did you see this? Did you see this? I never in my lifetime, when we talk about the market of beasts, and we've seen the technology and all that, that never did I think the mindset of people would be ready to receive that. But you see what happens with COVID over the last year, Chris. What do you now it's almost like they want to, you flew here from Dallas, but they're getting to a place where, you can't hardly even fly unless you have a shot. If you could show proof and everything else, we're not very far where everybody say, yes, let's go ahead and get a mark.
Exactly. Now, I'm sure everybody kind of really can see that on the horizon, that a very small group of people can make decisions for you, and you don't have really any ability to protest against it or make any kind of a change in it.
Yeah.
It is what it is. And because they're the authority, there's not a whole lot that you can say about it. Protest all you want, it's going nowhere. So that is, again, such an interesting development, if you want to call it, that we really probably never expected to see it here in this country. We expect to see that in the third world. We expect to see that where you see the dictators throughout the ages and all that stuff, but we've always thought of ourselves as being, self-reliant and all the rest of that. What has really, really changed is that you put enough fear in people, they will do things that are really not in their best interest.
Yes.
And we've proven that. And that's happened worldwide, but even more so here. So, interesting times.
What a glorious first program. Again, if you're just tuning in, we're live at Agape Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. Chris is here from Texas, and so we thought we'd take advantage of it. We encourage you, if you missed the previous programs, we have it on demand where you can watch it, and either at his channel or also over at Agape Chapel. And so on behalf of Chris, this is Terry. May God richly bless you.
Don't dress up my gospel in fancy clothes. Don't gloss up my Jesus for the London shows. He'll take care of himself wherever he goes. You just say it like it is. Say it like it is. Say it like it is. He didn't come to put mysteries within your mind, or even go to college to study for words that rhyme. Man, he would never have even wasted his time. He just said it like it is. Said it like it is. Said it like it is. Don't fix my Jesus in some stained glass frame.
For information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time.